the Branch Davidian compound, just a handful of miles outside of Waco, Texas, things had been overseen for years by a man named David Koresh. Born with the name Vernon Wayne Howell, David had assumed this new name years beforehand, after returning from a trip to Israel. He had evidently stumbled upon the teachings of Cyrus Teed, another preacher from a century beforehand, who had similarly assumed the name Koresh and followed a similar prophetic path. Afterward, David Koresh had transformed himself fully into the leader of the Branch Davidian Church, having overcome some legitimate adversity in the process. After unsuccessfully wresting control of the group and its compound from his longtime rival, George Roden, Koresh had led his most devoted followers on a wandering trip between rural Texas and sunny California for a few years, until eventually he was able to get George Roden out of the picture. In the years that followed, Koresh cemented himself as the leader of the church, using his affinity for the Bible to forge ahead with his own unique brand of Adventist sermons, centered around a pending war with the evil armies of Babylon, which would be quickly followed by the return of Jesus Christ. Koresh's preaching earned him dozens of supporters, men, women, and children, all of whom believed earnestly in his vision. Yet, there were those that became disillusioned with David and his increasingly strange demands of them. For years, David Koresh had subjected those that wanted to leave his compound, his church, to an exit interview of sorts. During these conversations, Koresh wanted to remind these individuals that their obedience to him wasn't out of any kind of selfishness on his part. Of course not. Rather, they were merely serving God through him, with him merely standing in as a vessel for the Lord to accomplish great acts in this plane of existence. Anyone that willingly chose to abandon their compound, abandon him, was abandoning God himself, and through it, their possible salvation. The message was quite clear. If you chose to leave, you were risking eternal damnation. Because not only were you turning your back on David Koresh, you were turning your back on God. Yet, despite this gusto, it seems like David Koresh didn't always think of himself as this impartial vessel for God. He spoke about himself often as an imperfect man, a sinner, who was just as capable of perpetrating wrong in this life as the rest of us. This double standard was not lost on Byron Sage, one of the FBI's lead negotiators, during his many conversations with David Koresh between March and April of 1993. In particular, a conversation that took place on March 17th. In it, Koresh seemed to dance around the idea that he was Christ, something that Sage attempted to capitalize on. Sage, a self-proclaimed Christian and a Vietnam veteran, was a skilled FBI negotiator that was able to use these little openings to try and press forward, to find some kind of compromise with David Koresh. But in doing so, he discovered that maybe Koresh's convictions weren't as rigid as he claimed them to be. As Byron Sage later recalled to reporters with PBS Frontline, "I tell him that I am absolutely confident in my salvation and he is not in a position to challenge it. Now, if anyone was in a position to try and challenge my faith as a Christian, it would be someone that perceived himself to be Christ. He does not assume that posture. From that point forward, it is absolutely patently clear in my mind what we're dealing with. This guy is not delusional. He is not a messianic complex. He does not buy off on his own con." 30 years later, questions linger over whether or not David Koresh truly believed himself to be what he claimed. Some, to this day, continue to believe that he was a messianic figure of sorts. Many, I would argue, most, would disagree. But his impact on the world continues to be felt more than 3 decades later, with the name Waco continuing to evoke the message that he preached. In the days leading up to April 19th, 1993, the US government had grown increasingly concerned that David Koresh and the rest of the Branch Davidians had no intention of surrendering anytime soon. FBI officials openly speculated that Koresh's writing of a manuscript centered around the Seven Seals was just another delaying tactic, meant to buy him and his supporters additional time inside of the compound. For what purpose was anyone's guess. Two religious scholars, James Tabor and Philip Arnold, had been talking to the FBI and consulting other members of the Branch Davidian Church. These scholars were attempting to figure out what the Davidians truly believed in order to help, and hopefully help Koresh and the FBI reach a compromise. Through their work, the two learned that the Davidians believed they were living through what writer Malcolm Gladwell described in a New Yorker article as a late stage in the end of time during which believers are asked to suffer through a round of bloodshed, to wait a little season, and then suffer a second round. If this was correct, then the Branch Davidians shootout with the ATF on February 28th was likely the first round. The second round, whatever that may be, was yet to come, likely in the form of a larger, longer armed conflict. Tabor and Arnold were able to communicate with Koresh through an audio tape that they put together, which was a detailed conversation about the Book of Revelation, and they were able to persuade Koresh to keep talking. This is what had preceded him agreeing to write a manuscript in April, to put his ideas down on paper once and for all, and hopefully peacefully surrender afterward. He seemed to positively respond to the idea of someone, or in this case, someones, speaking in his language, that of the Bible, instead of in trading lives like baseball cards, which he felt the FBI negotiators were doing. In a letter released to his lawyer, Dick DeGuerin, on April 14th, which would prove to be his last communication with the outside world, Koresh wrote, "I want the people of this generation to be saved. I am working night and day to complete my final work of the writing out of these seals. I thank my Father. He has finally granted me the chance to do this. It will bring new light and hope to many, and they will not have to deal with me, the person. I will demand the first manuscript of the seals be given to you. Many scholars and religious leaders will wish to have copies for examination. I will keep a copy with me. As soon as I can see that people like Jim Tabor and Phil Arnold have a copy, I will come out and then you can do your thing with this beast." That final line was meant for Dick DeGuerin and meant to reference the ongoing siege. Those inside the compound believed that this was all finally coming to an end. They believed that the publishing of David Koresh's manuscript on the Seven Seals would bring this fiasco to a close. Those on the outside, however, did not believe that this was the end for David Koresh. For starters, Koresh had made and broken similar promises in the past, having agreed to surrender if the government helped distribute an audio tape of his. Afterward, he had immediately rescinded that and prolonged the siege for another 2 months. Hoping to gauge whether this was truly possibly the end, government officials consulted with mental health experts. While not all of these experts agreed on the finer points, they all seemed to echo the belief that David Koresh was unlikely to surrender anytime soon. Carl Raschke, famed cult researcher, told reporters with the Chicago Tribune in April of 1993, "They do not see themselves as martyrs. They see themselves as agents of God's wrath on earth." Yet, others believed that mass suicide, the kind seen in Jonestown, was still a real possibility. Koresh, after all, had often spoken about his apocalyptic visions for the future, and that thinking had been instilled in even the youngest children saved from the compound, who had been surrendered to the government's custody in the preceding weeks. Even they believed in this hellish vision for the world, that their lives would end in flames if they did not resist until their dying breath. While many cautioned the FBI to continue holding out, to let David Koresh see out this manuscript however long it may take, likely upward of 2 weeks, others were hesitant to let him have that time to write what they joked was an autobiography or a memoir. On the ground, they were becoming increasingly unwilling to give David Koresh any more time. In the preceding weeks, the government had begun to formulate a plan to end the Branch Davidian holdout once and for all. As I touched on in the last episode, this plan was formulated at the highest levels of the government, with members of the FBI and their hostage rescue team sending numerous drafts of this plan to newly appointed Attorney General Janet Reno. At first, Reno had balked at the plans, but as days passed without any sign of progress on the ground, she allowed these plans to move forward. She brought word of the operation to President Bill Clinton on April 18th, and he later recalled, "I told her that if she thought it was the right thing to do, she could go ahead." Later, Janet Reno would struggle to pin down a specific rationale for why she okayed the plans as they were and allowed them to move forward after saying no, rather emphatically in fact, just days beforehand. At first, she claimed that it was the rampant allegations of child abuse and sexual assault inside the Davidian compound that encouraged her to move forward with the HRT's proposed plan. If you recall, this had ultimately helped spawn the government's case against David Koresh, with Koresh having had sex with numerous underage girls in the many months before the ATF's failed raid. Numerous claims of child abuse had also been made, but there was no proof that this was ongoing inside the compound. At first, it was proposed that the FBI should engage in a more frontal, all-out assault, but that plan was rejected outright. Many theorized that the Davidians wouldn't hesitate to use the children inside as human shields, with a lot of FBI officials arguing that they had already been doing that for 2 months, using the potential mass casualties inside as an effective deterrent. Later, when pressed on her belief that children were at risk inside of the compound, Janet Reno relented that there was no proof. Then she admitted that she had moved forward with the HRT's plan because members of America's right-wing militia movement were on their way to Waco to throw in their support to the Branch Davidians, potentially making a volatile situation even more explosive. However, there was even less proof of this than there was the ongoing child abuse. Despite supporters of the Branch Davidians gathering in or near Waco, there was no sign of a collective push to help support the religious movement in a tactical way. In fact, a cable from the FBI's Indianapolis office in April of 1993 identified the target of Janet Reno's ire, the unorganized militia of the United States, as exactly that, unorganized. This quote-unquote militia that Janet Reno referred to was really just a middle-aged attorney named Linda Thompson, who had gathered a small group of approximately 30 supporters to gather in and meet in Waco to protest the government. You'll hear a bit more about Thompson later in this episode, but she was far from the military threat that Janet Reno cited her as. While the rationale for why this plan was eventually okayed has never been firmly established, it was set to begin on the morning of April 19th, 1993. The FBI planned to use explosives from within their Armored Combat Engineering Vehicles, or CEVs, to punch holes in the outer walls of the Branch Davidian compound, and then pump in CS gas over approximately 48 hours. The rationale being that the Davidians inside were known to have gas masks, which were effective for approximately 2 days. To counteract the effectiveness of these masks, the FBI would intermittently pump in gas over approximately 48 hours, making the masks less effective over time. The holes punched in the exterior walls would give those inside an easy way out. Members of the FBI's HRT were directed not to fire at any Branch Davidians, but were given permission to return any incoming fire. What was originally envisioned as a non-lethal option to end this 2-month siege would sadly prove to be anything but. Early on the morning of April 19th, 1993, at approximately 5:59 a.m., the Branch Davidians received a phone call at a direct line established near their front door. On the line was the FBI's lead negotiator, Byron Sage, notifying them of an imminent assault on the facility using tear gas. At around the same time, a similar announcement was made over the loudspeaker system outside, letting the Davidians inside know that they were under arrest and should surrender quickly to spare themselves and their children any discomfort. After the call was received by the Davidians, Steve Schneider, who had spoken to the FBI that morning, threw the phone out the front door. Shortly thereafter, the FBI began using 2 of their CEVs to begin inserting CS gas into the compound, hoping to funnel those inside toward the large exits that they punched in the walls. In response, the Davidians began shooting at the vehicles outside. After this, the FBI would begin firing canisters containing tear gas into the windows of the compound, increasing the spread of the gas. These were 40mm Ferret brand CS gas rounds distributed through M79 grenade launchers, which were shot directly into the compound through windows. This made the area near the windows almost untenable for those without gas masks. Sporadic gunfire from those windows would continue, however. Within half an hour of the initial announcement, the entire Davidian compound was gassed, with things seeming to be progressing as the FBI had initially drawn up. At 7:30, a CEV breached the front side of the building and began injecting more gas. This was followed up by additional gas being inserted into the back of the building on the second floor about half an hour later. At 7:48 a.m., members of the HRT requested permission to fire a military-style tear gas shell into an underground bunker of the compound. They received permission to do so, and fired at least one shell into the concrete bunker a short time later. This would come up again later in the story, but did not seem to have played a major role in the ongoing assault. At around this point, the FBI requested additional gas canisters from a nearby Houston office, which would arrive about an hour later, near 9 a.m. That is around the time that Mother Nature began to rear her ugly head, with the wind temperatures rising, carrying the gas away from the compound. Those that believe in a higher power might call this fate, with winds reaching approximately 31 miles per hour that morning, and causing the gas near the compound to quickly dissipate. The National Weather Service had actually issued a wind advisory for the area that day, but this seems to have been ignored, or at least not noticed. Hard to tell what looks worse years later. Regardless, the FBI would carry on, using a CEV to make the hole in the front of the compound even bigger, hoping that increasing the square footage of the gaping hole there would begin to funnel out the Branch Davidians. Sadly, it would have the opposite effect, with no Branch Davidians choosing to leave. In fact, the large hole actually allowed the wind to gather, causing the CS gas to pump out of the compound at an increasingly alarming rate. Nonetheless, the FBI's HRT would continue to fire gas canisters into the compound sporadically for the next hour or so, laying off at around 11 a.m. Still, none of the Branch Davidians had left. Not even the children, whose faces were too small to fit into the gas masks procured by the Branch Davidians. Over the next hour, not much changed. Just after noon, another CEV punched a hole in an exterior wall, and about a minute later, trouble was spotted for the first time. At 12:07 p.m., roughly 6 hours after the FBI had begun injecting the Branch Davidian compound with CS gas, smoke began pouring out of a location on the second floor near the front door. Moments later, smoke could be seen emerging from somewhere else on the building's right side, and then again near the rear of the property. Government records would later report that the Davidians themselves lit these flames, igniting simultaneous fires at 3 or more different locations within the compound. Much has been said and written about the cause of these fires, but we'll touch upon this a bit later. Almost immediately after the smoke was first seen, the fire inside began spreading quickly. FBI negotiator Byron Sage called back into the compound again at 12:12 p.m., once again urging David Koresh to lead his followers out to safety. Shortly thereafter, a small number of Davidians would flee, with the fire beginning to tear its way through the building. Sadly, the situation was almost tailor-made to spiral out of control. The fire was encouraged by the continuous heavy winds, as well as the fresh holes that the FBI had just punched through the building, which did nothing but provide fresh streams of oxygen for the fire to continue to grow. It then fed on the repurposed wood that the Davidians had used to fortify their expansive compound months prior. Minutes later, at 12:25 p.m., members of the HRT would begin to hear the distinct sound of gunshots coming from inside the compound. These rounds were not being fired at them, but were popping off inside the building itself. It's believed that quite a bit of this was live ammunition being cooked by the fire, along with grenades and other explosives, which caused small bursts of extreme flame to punch large holes in the building and quickly collapse walls. However, it's believed that a not insignificant portion of the gunshots came from Branch Davidians inside, choosing to make the terrible, final decision to end their own or others' lives. The entire time that the building burned, film crews stood outside, exposing this tragedy to a horrified international audience. At approximately 12:41 p.m., firefighting efforts started at the Branch Davidian compound, but it was too little and too late. Roughly 15 minutes later, close to 1 o'clock, the fire had started to burn out, having torn its way through the entire building in less than an hour. Members of the FBI's hostage rescue team would begin entering the facility shortly afterward, searching the underground tunnels for any sign of survivors. Sadly, there were no hostages to rescue. Everyone still inside the compound had perished. Almost all of the Branch Davidians had fled down into the tunnels beneath the compound to escape the relentless CS gas from above, only to end up trapped in a confined underground bunker as fire began destroying the compound around them. An analysis of the scene would later reveal that the FBI's breaching operations on the west side of the building may have blocked a possible escape route through the tunnel system, making it impossible for the dozens of men, women, and children down there from escaping once the fire started. The largest concentration of deaths had come from this location, aptly named the bunker, the underground space built underneath the compound using concrete blocks. Survivors claimed that most had fled there shortly after the FBI began filling the compound with CS gas, while a few others had remained above with gas masks on. At least one small group of women and children were found underneath a fallen concrete wall in a storage room, having died due to skull injuries. It is unknown when the concrete wall had fallen, either during the breaching attempts by the FBI, which caused entire walls of the property to collapse, or the fire that had followed sometime later, which had thoroughly destroyed the remainder of the property. Most of those whose remains were found had died via smoke inhalation. It was believed that they had lost consciousness well before the fire reached the bunker. At least 50 bodies were found with significant levels of carbon monoxide in their system, although the saturation levels varied widely from 10 to 79%. It's not believed that any were still affected by the CS gas at the time of their death, with only one body found with traces of benzene, one of the main components of CS gas. The last ferret rounds had been shot into the compound roughly 1 hour before the fire started, and the winds had dispersed a fair amount of it in that time. One child had been fatally stabbed in the chest. It was believed that this was a mercy killing, likely from a desperate parent having to live out the most hellish possibility I can think of. Yet many were found with gunshot wounds, with at least 20 Branch Davidians having been fatally shot at close range. These were also undoubtedly mercy killings by members of the church, not wanting themselves or their children to suffer. Of the 20 that had died by gunshot, 5 were children under the age of 14. Some in the FBI believe, however, that some inside were shot as a deterrent to others, meant to keep other followers in line, more specifically, inside. One of the gunshot victims was none other than David Koresh himself, whose remains were found in the property along with more than 70 of his followers. His body had been badly burned, but it was later determined that he had died via a single gunshot to the head, likely administered by someone else. In a report filed to the Deputy Attorney General, Koresh died of gunshot wound to the forehead. His body was found in the communication room on the first floor of the building, nearby the door. A rifle barrel was found on the floor near his body. A piece of grenade shrapnel was also found in Koresh's body, but that wound probably occurred post-mortem when ammunition was exploding during the fire. Koresh's body was identified from dental records. He was 33 years old. The FBI later postulated that Koresh had been shot and killed by Steve Schneider, his top lieutenant and right-hand man, who had taken on a leadership role alongside David in the preceding months. Alongside Koresh, Schneider had acted as the Davidians' chief negotiator and was believed to have grown increasingly frustrated with the other man over time. Despite that, it's unknown why he had likely shot and killed David Koresh. Some believe he did so in an attempt to carry out David's suicidal ideation without having to get his hands dirty, while others theorize that Schneider might have committed the act in wrath, possibly out of revenge. The same report to the deputy AG that I mentioned a moment ago included the following detail. Schneider died of a gunshot wound to the mouth. His body was also found in the communication room. The common belief now is that Steve Schneider killed David Koresh and then himself. Months after the Waco tragedy, FBI spokesman Bob Ricks would tell a public panel, after Koresh had caused so much harm and destruction, he probably now wanted to come out, and Mr. Schneider could not tolerate the situation. He probably realized he was dealing with a fraud. While this remains unconfirmed decades later, it is possibly true, with Tarrant County medical examiner Nizam Pirwani, who performed autopsies on the bodies recovered from Waco, telling reporters with the Washington Post that it was possible for the FBI's account of Koresh's death to be correct. She also admitted that she and other public officials weren't privy to all of the FBI's knowledge. After all, the FBI had been in charge of the siege for nearly 2 months, overseeing it until its tragic and sadly preventable end. During their numerous dealings with the Branch Davidians, they had managed to install listening devices inside, and had been able to listen in on events unfolding in the compound. What exactly the FBI and other government officials had known, and when, would begin to come into focus in these subsequent days, weeks, months, and years, as the American public, the world really, began to digest what they had just seen unfold on their television screens in real time. Now, we're going to pause for just a moment to hear a word from today's sponsors. In the years since the tragedy in Waco, confusion lingers over almost everything. Namely, though, the fire. How did it start? And why did it spread so quickly through the compound, leaving almost nothing behind? The government insists, based on their own investigations, that the fire was intentionally started by the Branch Davidians in at least 3 different parts of the building. They claim that these 3 fires were started simultaneously in an effort to deliberately burn down the compound and immolate the Davidians. However, the survivors from inside say that this wasn't true, that it was possible the fire had been started, perhaps unintentionally, by the government's usage of CS gas. If you recall from the last episode, Attorney General Janet Reno had shown concerns about that very thing. It was speculated briefly that the FBI's pyrotechnic rounds might have somehow ignited the gas, causing the fire to break out in multiple spots at once. It was also theorized that one of the armored vehicles had knocked over a lantern inside the compound when it crashed into one of the exterior walls at 12:06 p.m. on April 19, 1993. But this was approximately 90 seconds before the first fire was noticed, and wouldn't explain how fire had broken out in 3 separate locations inside the building at once. The FBI, who had been conducting the siege for nearly 2 months, had managed to get numerous bugs into the Branch Davidian facility during the shipments of supplies. They claimed that Davidians inside had been recorded laying out the groundwork for the fire, having reportedly distributed Coleman fuel throughout the facility in the hopes that it would accelerate the building's burning. This included the following quotes just after 6 a.m. when the FBI had announced their imminent tear gas operation. "Have you poured it yet? Things are poured, right?" Approximately 10 minutes later at 6:10, a voice had stated, "Don't pour it all out, we might need some later." Over an hour later, at 7:23 a.m., a voice stated, "The fuel has to go all around to get started." Hours later, between 11:15 a.m. and 12:05 p.m., the following lines were recorded. "I want a fire. Keep that fire going. Do you think I could light this soon?" Yet, many would proffer that these recordings were very imperfect. Those that have listened to these tapes claim that it's hard to listen to the language used within, and lawyers for the survivors allege that the recordings don't quite capture what the FBI had claimed, that they had insisted they heard what was later published in official transcripts, but that wasn't clear in the audio. The fire spread quickly around the compound almost immediately after noon, spreading out from multiple locations seemingly at once. First, in two spots near the front of the building, on the left side near the front door on the second floor, and then on the far right side of the front. And then, moments later, began spreading out from the rear. This was evidently done by some kind of accelerant, but this is where the great controversy of Waco comes into focus. Was the accelerant fuel splashed around by the Branch Davidians trying to immolate themselves in pursuit of a higher purpose? Or was it the FBI filling a compound with a strange gas and then accidentally igniting it? Possibly with an incendiary round. If you trust the government's word on this, the former is correct. But if you ask the skeptics, they claim the latter. In the numerous investigations that would follow the Waco tragedy, the FBI would insist that they had not used any pyrotechnic rounds during the CS gas insertion. But that would be proven false in 1999, when an FBI spokesman clarified that at least one pyrotechnic CS canister had been deployed. Afterward, the FBI would amend their official statement nearly 5 years later, announcing that they had used a pyrotechnic round, but that they were still unlikely to have started the fire. However, in doing so, they had failed to produce a proper inventory showing the usage of at least one fired US military 40mm shell casing. It was later learned that the page showing the usage of that shell casing was quite literally hidden from federal investigators for more than half a decade, until the announcement revealed it. Approximately 100 FBI employees knew this information was being withheld from the public and from investigators, but just chose to say nothing. This single pyrotechnic round was fired at an underground bunker approximately 40 yards away from the main Branch Davidian compound, roughly 3 to 4 hours before the fire started. For that reason, it was unlikely to have been the cause behind the tragic fire. But the fact that this was so thoroughly covered up by dozens of FBI agents seemed to give validation to those among us that already had a reason to distrust the government. And it also soured what little trust the public still had in the FBI after watching the compound burn to the ground on live TV just a few years beforehand. This sentiment was encapsulated so well by Newsweek journalist Daniel Klaidman in an article he published in September of 1999. In it, he mentions the missing page of the FBI's inventory, aka page 49. The story of page 49 is much like the tale of Waco itself. The feds made mistakes and then exercised poor judgment by covering their tracks, making their motives look more suspect than they probably were. Despite not using this pyrotechnic round with any malicious intent, it appears that the FBI had not made any plans to deal with a fire. In the 568-page assault plan proposed to Attorney General Janet Reno back in 1993, which she had signed off on, nothing was listed involving contingencies for fire. That's why it took approximately half an hour for firefighters from the surrounding area to respond to the scene. That failure to think about fires ahead of time, paired with the high winds and the gaping holes in the compound punched by the FBI's armored vehicles, allowed the fire to burn unabated for more than 30 minutes before firefighters even arrived. Even if the government hadn't started the fire, which honestly I don't believe they did, it was their own ineptitude that led to it unfolding as horrifically and quickly as it did. They punched several large holes in the compound walls, providing it with plentiful oxygen, and then corralled the Davidians down into an underground bunker because of their proliferation of CS gas. Of course, that also ignores the fact that David Koresh and the rest of the Davidians were planning to surrender in a little under 2 weeks, according to survivors. The entire situation that day had been escalated by the FBI's hostage rescue team, who planned and carried out the tear gas operation from start to finish. The fire investigation of the scene itself was overseen by the Texas Rangers, who had cooperation from the FBI. This investigation concluded on July 13th, 1993, when the Rangers filed their report on the fire. In addition to more than 75 bodies recovered from the scene, the Rangers had recovered 305 firearms, as well as approximately 1.9 million rounds of cooked or spent ammunition, most of which had been destroyed by the fire. They wrote in their findings that arson was most likely the cause of the fire, including details supplied to them by the FBI, who had been surveilling the Branch Davidian compound with infrared aerial cameras. With these tapes, the FBI had been able to identify 3 spots in which the fire started at almost exactly the same time. As written in the DOJ's official report to the Deputy Attorney General, the arson team concluded that the fire was deliberately set by one or more persons inside the compound. The fire had 3 separate points of origin. The arson investigation established that those fires occurred in areas significantly distant from one another, but within such a short time frame that it was not possible for the fire to have been accidentally set or for it to have been caused by a single ignition. Additional findings from the arson investigation included: the arson team addressed whether the fire could have been started by the FBI's deployment of tear gas into the compound. The team concluded that the fire was not caused by, nor was it intensified by any chemicals present in the tear gassing operations. The team noted that the 2 methods used to deliver the gas were non-incendiary. The pressurized gas delivered through the combat engineering vehicles was sprayed through a nozzle using carbon dioxide as the propellant. The team noted that carbon dioxide would be incapable of igniting and might have even acted as a fire-inhibiting agent. The other method, 40mm ferret cartridges delivered by an M79 handheld launcher containing a non-burning, non-explosive liquid agent containing methylene chloride as the carrier, could not have had any incendiary effect either. The arson team likely concluded that, given the multiple simultaneous points of origin, the fire could not possibly have been started by a ferret round entering a window and knocking over a container of flammable liquid. Moreover, the arson team concluded, contrary to a theory that has been advanced by certain people, that the fire could not have been started by one of the combat engineering vehicles rupturing a propane container and igniting it. If that had happened, according to the report, an immediate vapor air explosion or flash fire would have occurred involving the vehicle itself. It did not happen. Finally, the team noted that, based on its investigation, a great many of the occupants could have escaped to the outside of the compound even as the building burned. Considering the observable means of exit available, we must assume that many of the occupants were either denied escape from within or refused to leave until escape was not an option. As you can imagine, this entire tragedy would begin to lead to many questions, many of which were political in nature. With this story involving so many high-profile political figures, namely the President of the United States and his Attorney General, along with some of the highest-ranking figures in the FBI, in a time where 24/7 news was becoming more widespread, this was inevitable. The volatile political situation at the time was only worsened by the Waco tragedy, leading to an ever-growing rift between Republicans and Democrats. Many on the fringes of the right wing would begin to use Waco as a cause célèbre, but that's something we'll dive into a bit later. Suffice it to say, there were many that wanted to use this tragedy to score political points against the current administration, who, it's fair to say, had completely fucked up the government's response to the Branch Davidians, not only in their plan of dynamic entry on the morning of April 19, 1993, but the entire siege itself, beginning after the ATF's failed raid on February 28th. After this highly publicized debacle, which again was occurring at the same time that 24/7 news stations were beginning to set up shop, there were many that wanted their pound of flesh in the public square. Many of the government officials involved were called in to testify, some in public, some in private, leading to several investigations that wanted to discover how things had gone so terribly wrong in seemingly every way.
At the House hearings on the Waco siege, emotional testimony is heard once again. Yesterday, a federal agent tearfully described his frustration at negotiating with cult leader David Koresh. Jim Kavanaugh said Koresh thought he was God and would never have surrendered. Kavanaugh was adamant that the Branch Davidians and not federal agents fired the first shot in the initial February 1993 raid.
We had already tried to get our wounded agent, who was trapped in an alcove back there next to the tower, Agent Kenny King. We tried to move a team to get him, but they just opened up on us.
Republicans are now focusing on the use of tear gas to end the siege. That last-ditch measure was approved by Attorney General Janet Reno. Reno is set to testify Monday.
Attorney General Janet Reno is defending her decision to use tear gas to end the standoff at the Branch Davidian compound, but she says no one will ever know what the right decision should have been.
terms of Waco, I'm faced with the same position, that I could have gone in with a frontal assault, which could have been extraordinarily dangerous to all concerned, and we knew that up front. I could have waited, and I won't know and will never know what David Koresh might have done 6 days later, or 6 months later, or 6 years later.
Meantime, at yesterday's Waco hearings, the FBI's former Deputy Director Larry Potts says the goal of the gas attack was only to move negotiations along with David Koresh. Former FBI Director William Sessions is set to testify today.
In the news this Wednesday, the end of the Waco hearings. Attorney General Janet Reno blames cult leader David Koresh for the deaths of Branch Davidian children. But in hearings before the House Waco Committee, Reno took full responsibility for the decision to tear gas the compound. The gassing was followed by a fire and the deaths of some 80 cult members. Reno disputed claims that Koresh would have surrendered peacefully in time.
But when you tell me, because if you're correct, I lit a fuse that killed...
No, I didn't accuse you of doing that. I said we.
Okay.
I used the word W-E, we,
but
as a government.
It has been characterized, and I think that's the reason it's so important, that we are careful. I join with you in just saying...
Did you really think that I meant you?
I really did, sir,
okay,
and it
well,
hurts.
The panel is expected to issue a report on the hearings by early next year. Democrat Charles Schumer says they learned no new major facts.
The House Waco hearings are over, but we won't hear a final report for some months now. Democrat Charles Schumer says no major new details were revealed during the hearings, and committee co-chairman Bill Zeliff says the panel found no grand conspiracies, but did find some government agencies had lost touch with their missions. Attorney General Janet Reno testified yesterday that the deaths of the Branch Davidian children will haunt her.
This instance will be etched on my mind for the rest of my life. Those children, no matter how they were found, the fact that they are dead is a tragedy that will be with me for the rest of my life.
But Reno placed the blame for the death squarely on cult leader David Koresh. Reno also says she made the decision to tear gas the compound, which led to a fire and the deaths of some 80 cult members. Committee co-chairman Bill McCollum also says he's convinced the Davidians did start the fire, and he says he thinks President Clinton was not involved in the decision to gas the compound. Congressional Waco hearings come to a dramatic end with testimony by Attorney General Janet Reno, but it's not clear what House members have learned from all the testimony. Patrick McGrath has more.
Some House Republicans tried hard to pin the blame for Waco on President Clinton.
Leaders do not dodge. They do not let others take the blame.
But the final witness, Attorney General Janet Reno, testified that presidents ought not to interfere with law enforcement, and on Waco, Bill Clinton didn't.
He did not intervene in law enforcement issues except to ask good questions and to make sure that we had explored every opportunity. Some people say the president didn't take enough responsibility, and then during the course of these hearings, other people have said he exercised too much responsibility. I think he did just right.
After 10 days and almost 100 witnesses, the Waco hearings did not produce any dramatic evidence that President Clinton was anything more than a chief executive who accepted the advice of Reno and his top law enforcement officials, that the situation inside the Branch Davidian compound had deteriorated to the point where it was necessary to use tear gas to try to end the Waco siege. Koresh and his lieutenants responded by setting fire to the building, killing more than 80 people. Reno testified the gas was safe to use against children, but some Republicans disagreed.
But after hours of gassing undoubtedly tortured these infants before they were finally suffocated, according to the autopsy reports. Knowing this today, would you still proceed in the same manner?
Those children, no matter how they were found, the fact that they are dead is a tragedy that will be with me for the rest of my life. You do not have to talk in those terms. What we have got to do is to work together to avoid such tragedies for the future.
In the more than 2 years since Waco, Reno says the FBI has significantly improved its manpower and training for dealing with future hostage barricade situations. From Capitol Hill, Patrick McGrath, Fox News.
Despite most of the Branch Davidians perishing during the events of April 19, 1993, there were thankfully dozens of survivors. 14 adults and 21 children had left the compound in the days and weeks ahead of the fire that burned it down. There were also 9 that managed to escape on the day of the fire, many of whom were later retained in police custody and charged with miscellaneous crimes, such as aiding and abetting the manslaughter of federal agents or firearms charges. 8 were ultimately convicted on a wide range of charges, but as of 2007, all had been released, their sentences fully served. Many have since gone on to tell their stories through memoirs or documentaries, while a few remain tight-lipped to this day, understandably hesitant to share their stories. Several civil suits were later filed by the surviving Branch Davidians against the federal government, calling into question their handling of the initial ATF raid and the subsequent FBI siege, both of which were evidently marred with issues. But all of these civil suits were ultimately unsuccessful in swaying a jury, with the government successfully able to argue that the Davidians had been the one who set the fire within their compound, and had had more than adequate time beforehand to leave the building. Despite the numerous investigations that followed, very little consequence trickled down to those responsible for overseeing the government's actions in Waco. 2 ATF agents, Chuck Sarabin and Philip Chodnacki, were fired. If you recall from a couple of episodes back, these two had been criticized by several ATF agents for failing in their supervisory roles during the initial failed raid that led to several Davidians and ATF agents dead. These two had ignored multiple warnings from undercover operatives on the ground that David Koresh and the rest knew they were coming, and had had adequate time to prepare before the ATF arrived en masse about an hour later. However, despite being fired, these two were later reinstated at a lower rank and received full back pay with benefits, their careers mostly unfazed by the largest blunder in ATF history. Despite the government's bungling of the Branch Davidian situation, the numerous investigations led to very few repercussions for those involved in the planning or carrying out of said bungle. However, this tragedy did lead to some major changes in how law enforcement handled similar cases, especially as it pertained to the communication and strategy between the negotiating and tactical units. The FBI's lead negotiator during the saga, Byron Sage, told the Austin American-Statesman in 2018, "Probably one of the biggest lessons learned from this is that the tactical teams and the negotiators absolutely need to be on the same sheet of music. What we're saying, they've got to be mirroring with their actions. And what they're doing with their actions, we need to be aware of so that we can mitigate any kind of concern the opposite side might have with it. We didn't have that. That was a major breakdown." This tragedy also led to overhauls in how government agencies operate, namely law enforcement divisions. The ATF completely overhauled their special response teams, hoping to prevent events like the botched February 28th raid from ever happening again. Other law enforcement agencies, including the local agencies from our counties and cities, began investing heavily in their hostage rescue, warrant execution, breaching, tear gas, and other specialized capabilities. Some would argue that this isn't a good thing, especially in light of talking about how an extremely large militarized police force failed, but that's not a conversation I'm prepared to have at this moment. Now, we're going to take another quick break. Months ago, when I interviewed author Jeff Gwynne ahead of the release of his book on this subject, Waco, David Koresh, The Branch Davidians, and A Legacy of Rage, we briefly touched upon the final part of that title, this aptly named Legacy of Rage. You see, in addition to being an extremely tragic story and a cautionary tale, the entire saga of Waco was really a harbinger of what was to come, a necessary prelude to the next few decades in the United States. In her reasoning for allowing the tear gas operation from April 19, 1993 to move forward, Janet Reno had stated that the militia movement in America was becoming galvanized by David Koresh and his followers. However, she seemed to be stating this in the sense of direct support, weapons, supplies, bodies, and not in an abstract sense. However, in allowing this plan to move forward, directly or indirectly leading to the deaths of these dozens of men, women, and children, she and the FBI had made martyrs out of every single fatality that day. The militia movement in the United States had not been physically rallying around David Koresh and the Branch Davidians, but after April 19th, that would change. Those same movements now had evidence that their worst fears were accurate, and they would immediately begin to rally around what they perceived to be the biggest example of government overreach seen in a century, perhaps longer, maybe ever. Among these specific agitators cited by Janet Reno was Linda Thompson, later dubbed by Esquire the White Woman from Hell. Thompson was a lawyer and anti-government activist, the founder of the American Justice Federation and self-proclaimed leader of the Unorganized Militia of the United States, a ragtag group of supposed freedom fighters that gathered in early internet chat rooms. Linda Thompson was able to gather a lot of support for her anti-government sentiments after Waco, and tried to capitalize on the government's failings there to create an echo chamber, pretty much the prototype of the ones we see or hear of today. She began to spread her ideas through websites and internet forums dedicated to political rants and conspiracy theories. She had a lot of her own, some of which you're likely familiar with. If you've ever heard of the theory that Bill Clinton had dozens of people around him killed, the Clinton body count conspiracy for those looking this up on Wikipedia, then you are undoubtedly familiar with ideas populated by Linda Thompson. Others may be familiar with the idea that the government was creating FEMA camps to stash undesirables in their pursuit of a new world order. That's another one from her greatest hits. Both of these ideas were among those spread by Linda Thompson early on, with both becoming rather mainstream ideas among the fringes of the right wing in the years to come. While Linda Thompson would die of a prescription drug overdose in 2009, her legacy lives on to this day. You see, in addition to the insane conspiracy theories that clutter the dark corners of YouTube 30 years later, she also had a more immediate impact on the world. Shortly after the Waco tragedy, Linda Thompson released a series of videos, which she distributed herself. These videos were part of a series called Waco, the Big Lie, published in 1993 and followed up with a sequel, Waco 2, The Big Lie Continues, the next year, 1994. These videos were very ahead of their time, making several allegations about the Waco siege and seeming to allege a government conspiracy to kill the Branch Davidians and cover it up retroactively. These videos made a little splash when they were released, getting mostly distributed through gun shows and mail-order catalogs, but they would begin to gain national prominence later on when it was revealed that a young veteran named Timothy McVeigh had watched Waco the Big Lie numerous times, along with a friend of his, Terry Nichols. Both had started down the road to radicalization well ahead of time, but became desperate to do something once they watched these tapes. McVeigh was a young Army veteran that had grown up in New York and was a huge gun proponent from an early age. During his short-lived Army career, he had shown several racist inclinations, using racial slurs and assigning undesirable work to black servicemen under his command. After leaving the Army 4 years after enlisting, McVeigh fell down the rabbit hole of conspiratorial thinking, beginning to consume more and more racist and anti-government propaganda. He became a hardlined proponent of absolute gun rights, and believed that any infringement on his right to bear arms was a direct attack on him and his civil liberties. He felt the same way about taxes, and basically anything else he didn't like. Timothy McVeigh, still in his early 20s at the time, seemed to blame all of his problems on everyone else. The government just seemed to make a convenient scapegoat at times. He blamed society for him being unable to find a girlfriend. He blamed others for his inability to pay back loans after gambling away his money. He blamed taxes for his inability to succeed. In 1993, as the siege in Waco unfolded, McVeigh drove down to Central Texas to show his support and distribute some pro-gun rights literature. He had already become radicalized, but the tragedy in Waco was the straw that broke the camel's back. McVeigh became increasingly willing to risk his life for what he believed in, telling others about his belief that the FBI members involved in the failures at Waco and Ruby Ridge should be executed. On April 19, 1995, on the 2-year anniversary of the Waco tragedy, McVeigh parked a Ryder truck in front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. He had packed it full of ammonium nitrate fertilizer, nitromethane, and diesel fuel, approximately 4,800 pounds in total, and lit a 2-minute fuse. The ensuing blast killed 168 people, including 19 children located in a daycare center on the second floor. 684 others were injured, and the entire front of the Murrah building was sheared from existence. To this day, the Oklahoma City bombing remains the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in American history, and the second deadliest overall behind September 11th. Afterward, Timothy McVeigh expressed little remorse and blamed the government's actions in Waco for his senseless act of terror. He was later executed in 2001. We have seen the Waco tragedy come into play in other acts of terror, including one that I covered on the show some time ago. The derailing of the Sunset Limited train in Arizona in 1995, just months after the OKC bombing. The act left one man dead and dozens more injured, and to this day remains unsolved. No one has been held to account for the Sunset Limited derailment, with a mysterious entity calling themselves the Sons of the Gestapo, or SOG, leaving behind strange cryptic letters near the site. In these letters, they directly alluded to the perceived government overreach in both Waco and Ruby Ridge. In the years since, the Waco saga continues to live on. Despite not all of us having memories of the events as they unfolded, Waco is still often cited as the go-to example for government ineptitude. Hell, how many of us simply hear the name Waco, a city of more than 100,000 people, and immediately think about the saga involving David Koresh? But outside of the story's perseverance in the mainstream, it continues to be used as a rallying cry among those on the fringes of society, including the underground militia movement, which is just as alive and active now as it has ever been, perhaps even more so than 30 years ago. Just recently, former President Donald Trump gave a speech at Waco, in which a longtime Branch Davidian, Charles Pace, told Rolling Stone that Trump was making a statement by going to Waco. Tom O'Connor, a retired FBI expert on right-wing militant violence, told The Intercept that Trump was indeed making a statement by going to Waco, stating, "It will be perceived as a coded message of revolution to those on the extreme." More than 3 decades after the fire that ended the lives of so many Branch Davidians, the location where their compound once stood is mostly empty, other than a small chapel where adherents of the Branch Davidian faith continue to gather for congregation. They've since renamed themselves the Branch, the Lord Our Righteousness, and are headed by Charles Pace, a longtime Branch Davidian who arrived in Waco in 1973, when the church was still being overseen by the Roden family. Pace lived through the deaths of both Benjamin and Lois Roden, and chose not to continue following along when David Koresh, then Vernon Wayne Howell, became its new heir apparent. Pace believes that Koresh was someone that twisted the words of the Bible in a way that he could not tolerate, and that Koresh was the means by which Satan came to impersonate the descendant of Christ. In 1984, Pace left the Branch Davidian Church and relocated to Alabama, where he was living at the time of the FBI siege nearly a decade later. He returned to Waco the next year, 1994, believing himself to be the one to return the branch to its roots, its true theology as he puts it. Pace preaches that the world is set to end during his lifetime, and that all of those who don't adhere to his faith will perish. Many of those that once followed the Davidian faith believe him to be a fake, an opportunist. Nonetheless, he seems to have become the current successor to the Mount Carmel property by happenstance, having taken over the Branch Davidian hierarchy that started more than a century ago, when Victor Houtef and the Shepherd's Rod movement relocated from California to Texas. In 1994, survivors from the Waco tragedy led an effort to plant 82 trees at the Mount Carmel Center, one for each of the Branch Davidians that died in 1993. Charles Pace later decided to chop down the tree belonging to David Koresh. After spending the last few months immersed in everything Waco, I can't say that I blame him, but it still hurts my heart to know that these trees are just reminders of human beings that once strived to feel happiness and comfort. They weren't all devoted followers of Koresh by choice. Many were misguided and mistreated in life. Many were also children who had no say in the matter. Clive Doyle is a figure that I've mentioned sporadically throughout this series. He was a Branch Davidian from Australia who had been following along the Adventist and Davidian movements for decades, dating back to his childhood. Doyle had lived in Waco with his family for some time leading up to the ATF's raid and the FBI siege, and ended up becoming one of the 9 survivors from April of 1993. Sadly, one of his daughters, Sherry, died in the fire. Doyle himself was later treated for significant burns and was later put on trial alongside the other survivors, of which he was acquitted on all charges. Years later, Clive Doyle continued to live in Waco and was a constant presence at all of the memorials. Despite his continued faith, he seemed to be a man that was forever changed. Speaking to reporters with Texas Monthly in 2018, he stated, "Somebody asked me one time, they said, 'Do you blame David Koresh for all that happened, do you?' And I said, 'No, I blame God. God is supposed to be in control. God permitted it to happen for a reason.'" Doyle died of pancreatic cancer in June of 2022 at the age of 81. Yet, until his final breath, he and others believed that the end of this story had not been written. These adherents believe that those who perished back in 1993 are destined to return to this earth. This includes David Koresh. Speaking to Texas Public Radio in 2013, Clive Doyle stated, "We survivors of 1993 are looking for David and all those that died either in the shootout or in the fire. We believe that God will resurrect this special group." Sadly, the list of those who died at the Branch Davidian compound on April 19th, 1993 is rather extensive, but I'm going to close out this episode by listing all of them, along with their corresponding ages. I would like to end this series by just hoping that their names can be heard one more time. Catherine Andrade, 24. Chanel Andrade, 1. Jennifer Andrade, 19. George Bennett, 35. Susan Benta, 31. Mary Jean Borst, 49. Pablo Cohen, 38. Abadawalo Davies, 30. Sherry Doyle, 18. Beverly Elliott, 30. Yvette Fagan, 32. Doris Fagan, 51. Lisa Marie Ferris, 24. Raymond Friesen, 76. Sandra Hardiel, 27. Zilla Henry, 55. Vanessa Henry, 19. Philip Henry, 22. Paulina Henry, 24. Stephen Henry, 26. Diana Henry, 28. Novelette Hipsman, 36. Floyd Houtman, 61. Sherry Jewell, 43. David M. Jones, 38. David Koresh, 33. Rachel Koresh, 24. Cyrus Koresh, 8. Star Koresh, 6. Bobby Lane Koresh, 2. Jeffrey Little, 32. Nicole Gent Little, 24, along with her unborn child. Dayland Gent, 3. Paige Gent, 1. Livingston Malcolm, 26. Diane Martin, 41. Wayne Martin Sr., 42. Lisa Martin, 13. Sheila Martin Jr., 15. Anita Martin, 18. Wayne Martin Jr., 20. Juliette Martinez, 30. Crystal Martinez, 3. Isaiah Martinez, 4. Joseph Martinez, 8. Abigail Martinez, 11. Audrey Martinez, 13. John Mark McBean, 27. Bernadette Monbelli, 31. Rosemary Morrison, 29. Melissa Morrison, 6. Sonia Murray, 29. Teresa Nobrega, 48. James Riddle, 32. Rebecca Saipaya, 24. Steve Schneider, 43. Judy Schneider, 41. Mayana Schneider, 2. Clifford Sellers, 33. Scott Kojira Sonobe, 35. Florisita Sonobe, 34. Gregory Summers, 28. Aisha Gurfus Summers, 17, along with her unborn child. Startle Summers, 1. Lorraine Sylvia, 40. Rachel Sylvia, 12. Hollywood Sylvia, 1. Michelle Jones Thibodeau, 18. Serenity Jones, 4. Chica Jones, 2. Little One Jones, 2. Neil Viega, 38. Margarita Vega, 47. Mark H. Wendell, 40.